Hi, my name is Ken Davidian, and welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of Organization Theory in Space. This video series is based on the Oxford Handbook of Organizational Change and Innovation, edited by Marshall Scott Poole and Andy Van de Ven. In this episode, we're going to talk about the first major part of the handbook on the topic of the teleological models of change. As you recall, the teleologic motor is one of the four idealized motors of how change occurs. In reality, multiple motors are working at multiple levels of analysis in combination and in dependency with each other, but we'll treat each one separately to better understand their individual attributes and characteristics. You probably remember from our first episode of OT in Space that the teleologic change motor is driven by a central agent who sets the long-term goals and coordinates with other actors to work together to achieve those goals. This is a very good way to efficiently use resources and produce a high-performing product. This first part of the handbook covers 5 chapters, and we'll do a deep dive into each one in Season 2 of OT in Space, but for now, we'll just recap each of the chapters in a sentence or two. Chapter 2 is entitled Historical Currents in Scholarship of Organizational Change. Here I just call it Historical Academic Currents. 7. Since organizations are widely recognized as being open systems instead of closed systems, this chapter covers 10 characteristics of open systems that focuses on the distinction between an organization deciding what to change versus how to implement the changes. What an organization decides to change is typically determined by what is happening in the external environment. This chapter identifies and describes 7 integrated models of organizational change, and then discusses 3 different reviews of practitioners' recommendations. After all that, this chapter identifies a 10-step process of evidence-based principles for change management. Chapter 3 is entitled Dualisms and Dualities in the Ongoing Development of OD, or Organizational Development. OD is the combination of theory and practice of organizational change. In the service of full disclosure, I am not an OD guy, but let's move on. Anyway, there are 3 major developments in OD covered in the chapter. The first is the distinction between diagnostic and dialogic OD approaches. It seems that there are 2 different motors of change going on here. The diagnostic approach is teleologic in nature, identifying the problem, identifying the solution, and then implementing it. And the dialogic approach is more dialectic, where 2 individual ideas come together and a synthesis, something different than the original 2, comes out the other end. The second major development is how OD is constantly being described as being reborn, while at the same time on the brink of extinction. Finally, the third development revolves around the scholar-practitioner divide within OD. Chapter 4 is entitled Upside Down Organizational Change. In this chapter, the authors note that societal shifts are often rooted in younger generations. Organizational change today is different from the past because of the particular skill sets possessed by this current younger generation. In the past, changes were characterized as top-down, revolutionary, well-planned, and transformative. Currently, change is being described as bottom-up, evolutionary, and incremental. Top-down, teleologic; bottom-up, evolutionary. By bringing social issues to the workplace, the younger generations are changing the problems their companies are solving. Instead of existing to solve customers' problems, companies are being driven to work towards solving the world's problems. Because the younger generation has mastered the tools of social media, they can directly influence the businesses they choose to work for. Chapter 5 is entitled Organizational Identity and Culture Change. In this chapter, the interplay between organizational culture and identity is discussed, basically trying to answer the existential question of who are we as an organization? The authors discuss many different theories of cultural change, including those from the fields of sociology, anthropology, as well as organizational theories of change. The dynamics between identity and culture, questions of agency, temporality, interrogating the relationships between who were we and who are we, and the relationships between image, identity, and culture are all addressed. Ultimately, the organizations teleologically attempt to direct these changes for organizational vision and strategy. Finally, the last chapter in this part of the handbook, Chapter 6, is entitled An Effectual Entrepreneurial Model of Organizational Change. The effectual entrepreneurial model conceives of organizations that move through time, acting on their environments, shaping and constructing those environments, challenging the idea that change is uniquely driven by the external environment, as we talked about in Chapter 2. Future change occurs because of many actions, choices, events, and actors. Outcomes cannot today be fully determined, fully predicted, fully controlled, or fully anticipated. And even though the model is teleologic in nature, the authors note that change that ultimately is realized in the future will likely be very different from the initially intended change. So, how is the space sector impacted by this discussion of the teleologic change motor? I would assert that all national space programs, in essence, use the teleologic change motor as the motor of change that drives the innovation in their activities. A central agent, the national government, sets a goal and will coordinate with their industrial base to help achieve that goal. Therefore, any models of the space sector that includes national space activities should include the teleological change motor in those models. That's all for this time. But next time on OT in Space, we'll give an overview of the second of the 7 handbook parts, this one discussing the dialectic motor of change. I hope you found the material interesting, and if so, please subscribe or hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss what comes next. OT in Space was produced by IRL, which stands for Impossible Research LLC. IRL conducts process research on the topics of innovation and industry emergence within the context of commercial space industries. IRL also offers organization theory and research consulting, as well as STEAM outreach. This video is intended for educational purposes only.